before we begin, do any of the judges have any preferences or anything they want to know?
I'll read my paradigm as I kind of wrote it out so I don't forget anything. So I do. I have a couple specific things that I'd like to see in the round. So I'm a parent judge. I'm not a coach, but I've been judging for 5 years now. I do not like calling for evidence, okay? So please resolve that as best you can inside the debate so I don't have to call for it. And evidence, I want to clearly know.
So we can ask each other, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the round,
Okay.
please don't make me call for your evidence and have to read through it. It's just not something that I like to do. It's not really done in Washington where I'm from. So I do flow, and I'm okay with speed. If you mention something in Crossfire, please extend it out for me and weigh your impacts well. If you win an argument, if you feel you win an argument, please explain to me why that argument is more important in a round than your opponent's argument, okay? So bring everything down into the final focus for me. That's what I ask.
I have a paradigm on tab room, and I'm a pretty typical flow judge. The one thing I'll note on is the summary and my thoughts on it, because I think there's varying interpretations of its role. I think the summary needs to frame voters, number one, as most judges would say, but also I think the only burden on it is to respond to your opponent's rebuttal. So that means I'm fine with offense being extended out of your rebuttal, like turns, for example, straight to final focus without them being mentioned in summary.
And do the other judges agree with that?
I am the exact opposite of that.
Okay.
Then
Hooray.
I'm okay with it, but it's not something I have an opinion on.
I will not evaluate it if there's not in the script.
Okay.
Adapt to him is what I'm saying.
Anything else?
Any more for you?
Actually,
No, I'm
just
fine.
specifically for you, can we extend like terminal defensive arguments that weren't extended, like if the
It has to be
extending
in
to-
summary.
Okay, so everything has to be.
Yes, like
Gotcha.
you'll draw a direct line between one and the other.
All right.
The couple things I will echo a couple things from over here. One is like for crossfire stuff, like it's got to be in speeches for me to evaluate it. Which yeah. The other is things like in terms of the actual impact weighing. Like you'd think here, yes, I've yet to see anybody actually do it, including I think like the girls around earlier. Here, like in the final focus, like don't just pile up impacts on my desk. I want the comparison. Otherwise, I do the comparison and you do not like it. I'm also fairly open to calling shenanigans on like really bad like debatey cards if like something's like blatantly not true, but you found a card for it. I've done enough reading to be like, that's not what's going on. I'll go, yeah, you know, like ISIS has taken Baghdad. Like no, yeah. And it's just like they don't have a card to say otherwise. It's like that's just not true. Don't try. That. Oh, and I'll evaluate, unless you put me someplace else, I'll evaluate almost exclusively in an offense-defense paradigm.
Yeah.
If you don't have offense, it's really going to be hard for me to vote for you.
Yeah, just to echo that, in the absence of clear weighing, I look for clean offense above anything else. So I'm not really into like looking at every argument comparison on an issue in the flow. So if it's muddled, I'd rather just look for what's clean on the flow. And maybe that's lazy, but oh well. It's not.
Any last words? Can we begin?
So you guys, is flipping done? Did I
Yeah.
know?
So
Okay.
University School
Okay.
is speaking first on the affirmative.
I'm gonna ask. Let me just put that on.
All three judges are ready. Opponents? And of course, Brian. Good as yes. Yep. We affirm. Contention 1, the need to intervene. Subpoint A, preventing atrocities.
The UN explains 1.2 million people were displaced by fighting this year in Iraq. In fact, the Daily Beast notes that ISIS fighters are killing faster than statisticians can count. Moreover, Obama's White House policy explicitly states preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest because A, America's reputation suffers when we sit idle, and B, massive civilian migrations and casualties fuel regional instability. With that, subpoint B, regional instability. ISIS causes instability in two main ways. First, ISIS has grown so large that other jihadist movements are now following it. USA Today notes ISIS has aligned itself with AQAP, Boko Haram, and many splinter jihadist groups in 7 countries. The problem is quickly spreading. Second, the Syrian civil war, perpetuated by ISIL, increases instability. As General Petraeus explains, Syria is a geopolitical Chernobyl. Until it is captured, is going to continue to spew radioactive instability and extremist ideology over the entire region. This empirically leads to more conflict, as the Global Terrorism Database finds that a combination of troops pulling out of Iraq at the end of 2011 and new jihadist opportunities brought on by the Syrian civil war have allowed ISIS to grow and has caused a spike in Iraqi attacks by up to 400%. The impacts of instability are twofold. First, a safe haven for terrorists. As James Piazza of UNC finds it, failed states are 10 to 15 times more likely to be the source of transnational terrorist attacks. Second, Stephen Whittle of George Washington University finds a regional war caused by Shia-Sunni jihadists would destroy 15% of world oil output, resulting in an oil shock 4 times larger than the largest oil shock in recent decades and doubling world oil prices, and finally cutting US GDP by 5%. The Economist furthers that even if unrest spreads to Saudi Arabia, oil prices would jump to $200 or $300 a barrel. This would cut global growth by over 1% and cause a global double-dip recession. The impact is given by Matt Saban, RSC explains a shortfall between demand and supply as little as 10 to 15% is enough to wholly shatter an oil-dependent economy and reduce its citizenry to poverty. Contention 2, troops prevent conflict. First, troops make airstrikes more efficient. Roger Scruton of Forbes finds only combat troops are able to confront the enemy and force them into the open. In the absence of an effective opponent, ISIS can adapt to airstrikes and then regroup. This is what we are seeing in the battle for Kobane. Second, local forces only make the problem worse. Foreign Affairs notes using Kurdish or Iraqi forces would fail because A, they won't make the sacrifices needed to keep Sunni majority territory, and B, these forces would inflame and mobilize the 20 million Sunnis in the region. Third, combat troops should also combat advise. David Painter of the Naval Postgraduate School finds that the most critical task required to conduct effective counterinsurgency operations is developing an effective post-nation security force. Long-term success only works if the country has their own security force to defend themselves. Reuters shows the effectiveness of our training as they note 400 US troops will train over 5,000 Syrian rebels annually, but will conduct thorough background checks to make sure they're training the good guys. Also, it worked in Iraq too. According to the International Relations magazine, the security forces were previously described as being fragmented and strongly under the influence of the militias. However, the increase in troop numbers allowed the security forces to become better trained and by the US military and less suspect to insurgent infiltration. Kenneth Pollock of the Brookings Institute explains why. A, American units partner with Iraqi units 24/7, and this constant partnership enabled American troops to remove the sectarians and corrupt while promoting competent Iraqi troops. And B, Iraqis were relieved to see American units because they knew that the Americans would prevent any violence against them from both the Sunni and Shia militias. Decreasing sectarian killings and promoting less corrupt officials reduces terrorism in the long run. James Walsh of UNC finds that raising human rights decreases terrorism by up to 40%. Thanks. Mr. President.
Can I ask a couple pieces of evidence?
Sure.
Can I see the oil truck evidence?
Yeah. Do you want case or full?
What?
Case or full?
I'm definitely more part of that.
Yeah. Which one exactly? Because there's one that I
ISIL will cause oil.
Whittle of George Washington?
Yeah, that's the impact of oil.
Okay.
And also the double oil prices and the double percent.
Yeah. Gotcha. It's George Washington.
doubling of oil prices and double the recession.
Yeah. All right. Here's what we'll-
Pay them all at the same time.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Opposite. Yeah, so
You don't have to take credit until finding out.
yeah, this is double on the evidence right there. Yeah. This is the double the recession. This is the part saying that it would cause shocks. Where's the one? ISO causes shock and it's double the recession. Yes. Okay. Alright, bro. Can you show us where in here the ISO part is in the first one? It's talking about the solution. Right. Where? Where do you want me to read? Yeah, sure. The top. Okay. Wait, I'm sorry, can we see the doubling of oil prices?
They just increased $200
Wait,
or $300 a barrel.
Yeah, $200, $300 a barrel. I don't think we can
But
double
where?
The second card.
Card right on. Yeah. And if oil price goes to
The ones that says that like ISIS would have
It
caused.
says unrest in Saudi
Okay.
Arabia.
Continue. Don't prep time.
Use about 30 seconds.
Can I have the card back?
Yeah.
Is there any way I could read it during the bubble?
Brian.
Do you need that one card?
You can have that one card, yeah.
Thanks.
Great crossword. Or I threw the case. Okay. Everyone's ready? Partner ready? Everyone's ready. Communicate and observe the primary interest of any nation is to protect the lives of its citizens. Convention 1 is true debts. According to Peter Nealon, our new invasion would look like a near repeat of our 2003 invasion of Iraq. A former CIA Deputy Director, Michael Morrell, finds an effective retaliation against the Islamic State would require 100,000 boots on the ground. Unfortunately, a repeat of mass deployment will bring a repeat of mass death. As RT News laments, America will inevitably have to die on the battlefield if we want to destroy ISIS. According to the Iraqi coalition casualty count, 4,500 Americans died in our last Iraqi ground war. Attacking ISIS with combat ground troops would inflict even more troop casualties in that time for two reasons. First is a longer conflict. Stephen Biddle of George Washington University writes that we can reasonably expect a ground war to last 10 years, much longer than we spent fighting the previous insurgencies. Second, more intense conflict. Brett McGurk of the U.S. State Department writes that ISIS is better equipped, better manned, better resourced, better fighters, and better trained than Al-Qaeda in Iraq that our forces faced last time. It is a global expansionist, global jihadist organization. It is swelled with foreign fighters and suicide bombers who will go wherever the organization tells them to go. As a result, the number of troop casualties will be devastating. Fighting terrorism simply isn't worth its massive loss of life. Foreign Affairs writes in the post-9/11 era, the United States has built up an extensive infrastructure of counterterrorism intelligence, which has helped make terrorist attacks on U.S. soil exceedingly rare. The University of North Carolina quantifies that in the 14 years after 9/11, Muslim-linked terrorism has claimed the lives of only 37 Americans. Even if fighting ISIL were to somehow eliminate all of Islamic extremism in the world, it would only save at most 3 lives a year. Ultimately, committing combat ground troops cannot possibly save more lives than it kill. Contention 2 is the political problem. According to the Foreign Policy Journal, the root causes of the ISIL insurgency come from disenfranchisement by the Iraqi government. In the absence of freedom, Iraqis lack legitimate outlets to express their political grievances, making them more likely to result in political violence and terrorism. Because the problem is political, the Foreign Policy Journal furthers that in the long term, the war against ISIL cannot be won with military action. In fact, military action against ISIL exacerbates the political problem for 2 reasons. First is the Hydra effect. According to Vox, non-ISIS terrorist groups have deeper roots in local towns and cities. Given their more resident ideology, these other groups might be able to mount a more powerful and deadlier insurgency. Just like ISIS emerged from the ashes of AQI, so will other terrorist groups emerge if we defeat ISIS. and second, propping up the Iraqi government. The New York Times writes that if we get militarily involved now, our actions could undermine a more inclusive political power-sharing agreement from emerging down the road. Al Jazeera explains that the foreign military assistance has contributed to the Iraqi Prime Minister's rigidity. The more U.S. support, the more he feels like he can refuse to compromise politically in order to stop the current insurgency. This only worsens the root cause of the current conflict. Contention 3 is anti-American terrorism. According to Eric Neumeyer of the London School of Economics, U.S. citizens only become victims of international terrorism because of Americans' engagement on the world scene. He explains that an important cause of the anti-American terrorism is U.S. military support to foreign countries, whose governments are in conflict with terrorist groups. Thomas Plumber of the University of Essex corroborates, writing that terror groups ultimately strive for political influence in their home country, and the greater American military support to that country, the more America represents a threat to this terrorist goal. Because according to Neumeyer, U.S. troops actively engage in counter-terrorist actions, and even when they don't, they help the government by performing some other necessary military duties for the country. This is problematic because Plumber finds that when America makes it less likely for a terror group to achieve its goals, an attack on American citizens in the homeland maximizes the strategic value of the terror group. By directly targeting America, the terrorist leaders hope to trigger American withdrawal from the region because they believe that attacking American civilians will ultimately induce the USA to withdraw from the Middle East and would enable them to expand their political influence in the region. For example, Osama bin Laden has repeatedly professed his conviction that the USA are cowards who will give in if only hit hard and long enough. This increased incentive to attack Americans means that committing American troops means more American deaths from terrorism, even if the mission is successful at ultimately reducing terrorism. Eric Neumeyer quantifies that a one standard deviation increase in U.S. troop presence raises anti-American terrorism by 30%. Yeah. Is everyone ready?
So we clearly state what's going to happen in the app world, but if you negate today's round, what happens in the neg world?
What happens in the neg world?
Yeah, what happens to ISIS?
We keep hoping for political solutions to the problem that will ultimately solve the root cause of the insurgency.
So you're not going to do anything about ISIS?
No, we're going to eliminate the root cause, which is the only way to fight ISIS.
Won't
May I ask a
ISIS,
question?
wait, won't ISIS just keep
Can I ask
expanding?
a question?
Won't ISIS just keep expanding?
No, because
Why?
the political problem will be reached. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. So, are combat ground troops being used right now in Iraq?
Sometimes, yeah, some of them.
They are. So we've committed combat ground troops already?
Some, yeah.
Then why does President Obama say we are not going to commit combat ground troops to the region?
Can a president lie?
So he's lying to the American public and all of us?
I mean, can a president like not tell the full truth and not say exactly what's going on with
Every
with our
congressional official and President Obama says we don't have combat ground troops in the region
Every
right now.
single congressional official? Can I see all of them?
Are you serious?
I mean, you're just making a claim about 100% of the
I
congressional officials.
feel like this is like a reality check, right? Like nobody is saying we have combat ground troops on the ground right now.
Then can you explain to me the
There's resolutions about whether we
Can
should
you
commit them.
Can you explain to me the thousands of U.S. counterinsurgency operations that we're doing with our special
I
operations?
can explain that to you, right?
Okay.
So after we left Iraq, right, we pulled out our combat ground troops, right? Correct?
Wait, just a question.
Did we?
Our special operations
I-
combat ground troops?
What?
Our special, like, spec ops combat ground
It
troops?
depends. You need to answer my question first, though. It'll get. I promise I'll get there. Right.
Okay.
So we pulled out our combat ground troops in Iraq a while ago, right?
Yeah, 2011. The end of
Right.
2011,
So
which is
after-
where we saw the increase in violence.
So after we did that, right? After we pulled out the combat ground troops,
Yeah.
what happened is we kept a residual force around, right?
Sure.
And if we pulled out the combat ground troops and we left in other people, those would probably be classified as non-combat ground troops.
What happened to the conflict
I'm
when
just
we
asking.
pulled out our
Those
combat
would be
ground troops?
non-combat ground troops,
This is
right?
like a really extensive line of questioning.
If
I'm
those
just
are
trying to get to
non-combat
the
ground
core,
troops,
like,
then those are the
issue.
same people that are conducting these operations. According to Foreign Policy Magazine, you can conduct targeted operations
So-
if you are a non-combat ground troops. Combat ground troop is a political term of art.
Wait. We have a definition from the White House that says the combat ground troops are A, combat ready, and B, see combat
Okay.
like a lot of the
Just
time.
because they see-
Therefore,
It doesn't.
these special operations
That's
are
key, then.
combat ground troops.
Wait.
So if Obama says there's
So,
no combat ground troops, it's simply wrong because
If
we
you're
have special
sourcing
operations
the
in
ICE, if
Iraq.
you're sourcing the White House in today's round, I think I'm winning this debate because the White House says we have not committed combat ground troops.
How do they define the combat ground
They
troops?
use the term combat ground troops, right?
Yeah, but like, how do they define it?
They define it as a large term like intervention in the country,
Wait,
right? It has to be some kind of
That's not a
sizable force
definition.
that is engaging on the ground with ISIL.
That's not a definition.
How is that not a definition? That's the way the term is used in this debate,
It's
right?
defined
in almost
as a
every
it's
round.
defined as a military member who's A, ready for combat, and B, sees it all.
Foreign Policy Magazine disagrees with you.
Alright.
Okay.
Alright, all three judges ready? Opponents, and of course Ben. Alright. On their first contention, they first talk about troops. That's 100,000 troops. That's talking about the Iraq war when we did a regime change. Nowhere do we advocate for that. But secondarily, Max Boot of the CFR finds that if ISIS spreads, which they even claim ISIS is better equipped and is expanding, that means that more U.S. troops are going to be mobilized in the future. There's three logical reasons why that's true. First is more regional instability means that it harms oil shock. It causes more oil shocks. Second, it means that Americans feel less safe at home. And third, it means that Americans are more war hungry. In fact, the majority of Americans already want to go and put combat troops right now. At that point, if we don't put them right now, we're going to put way more in the future. So it's highly probable. But then furthermore, troops make overall the conscious sacrifice to die to secure American interests. So you don't weigh those the same as actual American lives at home. But then secondarily, they say that overall ISIS is expanding. But the Department of Defense finds that thousands of special operations forces has dismantled the administrative capability and structure of ISIS. They're going to say, hey, they're not combat troops, but their own foreign policy evidence, which they're going to read next speech, actually says that this distinction is only political. They're functionally the same thing because they actively go out in combat roles and actively see combat. At that point, there's no distinction. But then furthermore, they say there's no U.S. attacks on soil. That's because we've been conducting counterterrorism operations with ground troops for decades. Go to their second contention on a political problem. First, they talk about the hydro effect. There's no hydro effect if the tribal groups are going to work with the United States. In fact, when you look specifically to the International Relations magazine, they find that overall Sunni tribes have rejected ISIS in the past and chose to cooperate with U.S. forces. In fact, that took the majority of the Sunni insurgency off the battlefield, and they gave us vital intelligence. That's why Bob Woodward of the Washington Times finds that overall, U.S. forces who trained and set up local security forces decreased overall violence in the region by 50%. But not just that, you can actually look to Kenneth Pollock of the Brookings Institute who finds that when thousands of more troops were deployed in Iraq, the fighting was literally shut down in Baghdad. And the warrant is very key here, because they drove them out of urban population centers, so they had no sway over the population. At that point, they literally have no recruitment potential. But then furthermore, go to my opponent's argument where they essentially say that there's no political solution. They concede in the crossfire that a political solution of the Maliki government is being reached. At that point, they concede that argument. But furthermore, the Brookings Institute finds that U.S. military severed the link between militias and civilians, so civilians no longer relied on militias, so they no longer voted for those militias in local elections. That way, it paved the long term for a more inclusive government. In fact, Kenneth Pollock finds that the U.S. learned from their past mistakes and is now committed to being politically involved in nations for the long term. That's why the Washington Post finds that even though we initially backed Maliki, due to U.S. pressure, Maliki stepped down. In fact, when we use conditional aid in the form of troops, we can overall make a difference. James Mirren of the University of North Texas looks at troops and finds that increasing troops increases democracy by 15% in crisis situations. But then, go to my opponent's last contender where they talk about anti-U.S. terrorism. First, their Neumeier evidence is non-unique because we're already intervening with airstrikes, so there's anti-U.S. sentiment with or without troops. Second, the Atlantic finds that literally ISIS wants to bring about a caliphate to attack the United States in the long term anyway, so if they don't attack us now, they're going to attack us in the long term anyway when they expand. So again, Neumeier is not unique. But furthermore, Daniel Choi actually looks at 166 countries and finds that terror pursuit missions actually decrease terrorism. That always on breadth and depth of analysis over the Neumeier evidence. But not just that, look to Kenneth Pollock who finds that when we sent troops in 2007, we decimated ISIS to the point where they literally couldn't conduct attacks anymore. But then, last but not least, Graham Woods of the Atlantic gives 2 reasons why U.S. military force would completely destroy ISIS, and you wouldn't see any of this backlash. Because A, when we take away their territory, they no longer have a legitimate caliphate, so they don't have recruitment potential. But B, and more importantly, ISIS literally follows their ideology to a T. But when they send U.S. troops on the ground, they're going to take all of their forces, put it in one region to be, because they believe there's going to be one final apocalyptic battle. At that point, we can literally end the fighting in a couple of days in that one region. That way, we're going to be solving. But last but not least, they're going to say that we're not going to solve for the long term, but that logic is stupid. Remember, they just are not very smart. The argument is that we should prevent a forest fire now, because tons of forest fires are going to happen in the future. We should prevent the fire now, that's why you will burn.
We'll take a little bit of prep time.
You've got a minute and 28 left.
my opponents ready? Partner? Yeah. Judges?
1 second. Yep.
Okay. So, 3 issues of framework. First is the delineation of what affirming actually does in the round. So my opponents say that there are combat ground troops on the ground today. But remember that the resolution advocates a change in policy. Even if what they're saying is true, what we're saying is that if you affirm, you put another 100,000 ground troops in the ground on top of that, and those are conventional ground troops. Those are enduring operations that Obama, that the White House says is like grounds for us. Second is the idea of the long term. And look, Brian said this was a stupid point, but it's really not, because it's not turning out off a fire, it's not putting out a forest fire and having another one come back. It's putting out a forest fire right now, and the second we leave, a worse one comes back. That's the Vox evidence that we give you in our second contention that says that when we take away ISIL, worse groups keep coming back. If they don't give you a long-term solution, it's no solution at all. And then the third thing is that we should value lives above everything else, because that's what the United States is here to do. That's going to not get responded to. So let's go to the first point about atrocities. 3 responses. First, cross-apply the analysis I made on American lives. They don't link into it. It's not going to be very weighable in today's round. Second, Al-Murray writes that the Iraqi government is also guilty of many humanitarian violations. Certainly handing territory back to Shia militias doesn't solve all of these issues, and they don't give comparative analysis. Third, aggression exacerbates humanitarian crises by incentivizing militants to be more aggressive in the short run. In Kosovo, Serbian forces switched from a policy of counterinsurgency to ethnic cleansing in March of 1999 in response to a decision to initiate military force. Next, let's go to their point about oil revenue. There are a couple of problems with this. The 2 biggest problems are the 2 pieces of evidence that they read me. The first is the Biddle evidence that says that it'll cost us $750 billion. That's the second estimate that Biddle does in this study. The first estimate that he does, I'll read, it says the first case might be an increase in 8 percentage points that cuts US GDP by 0.4 of a percentage point, which would be, quote, regrettable but manageable. Nowhere near like the apocalyptic consequences he was talking about later. The second impact deals with a doubling of the oil prices. Brian frames this as though like ISIS is going to cause oil prices to double, but that's not what the card says. The card says if oil prices rose to $200 a barrel, the impact of a double recession would happen. But it doesn't say ISIS would cause that impact. Don't give them any like link level analysis onto oil. And like again, they don't show how much more terrorism, how much more oil revenue is lost. It's fundamentally unweighable. Let's go on to like the solvency portion of the. And also as a response to oil, like one more response. ISIS sets fire to oil fields that come under ground assault that permanently destroys the utility of the oil in the area. So even if like everything that they're saying is true, if we put troops in the area, they burn the oil, you don't get any of the revenue anyway. So let's go into the solvency, which is their second contention. There's a lot of responses here. First, you cross-apply Nealon for my first contention, which says that like affirming sends in conventional ground troops on top of whatever force might be there. But here's the larger issue. We disagree with our opponents that any forces in like the territory right now are combat ground troops and should be ground troops. So my opponents say that spec ops on the ground are right now combat troops. They might be combat people, but they're not troops. They don't work for the Defense Department. They're not part of the US military. They're part of the CIA. It's just like, think about it intuitively. That's not what we're here to debate. That's not what you've heard over like the last 5 rounds. More importantly, they talk about the utility of these troops. They say that these troops make airstrikes more efficient by like pinpointing targets. But as of 2 days ago, the New York Times writes that the US is considering using Iraqi soldiers for this exact same task. We don't put American boots on the ground when we don't need to. Furthermore, they talk about advisory positions. But remember that non-combat troops can also advise, and after Iraq, we left behind 50,000 non-combat troops for that express purpose. Now, the difference between a non-combat troop and a combat troop is a political difference, but it's an important one. It's the difference between having a few people on the ground right now and Obama saying authorization for combat troops means 100,000 boots on the ground tomorrow. That's where you vote for us, because we link into the real world. Obama says we won't put in special operations. He says that we'll put boots on the ground. He says that it's going to be 100,000 people. That turns their Walsh evidence, which talks about a 40% increase in terrorism due to the humanitarian violations, because remember I said that aggression increases like chances of humanitarian violations, and ultimately this is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Thank you.
Can I see your evidence that says non-combat troops are the ones that are advising?
But sure, that's like the same, yeah, last round. Here you go.
Can I just use it for cross?
Yeah.
Here. Let me just scroll over to the
Like, we can just talk.
Yeah. Off your judgment, ready? Alright, so. Am I going to be more effective at rooting out corruption if I'm with the soldier on the battlefield or if I'm staying behind and not Washington engaging.
That's not the difference between a combat troop and a non-combat troop. As I said in my rebuttal, the difference between a combat and a non-combat troop is a political one. Specifically, the difference between an enduring and targeted.
Why do you say, wait, I just, really quickly, why does a political difference mean that there's a functional difference between the two?
Sure, I'm just going to explain, right? Because the political difference is very real. The political difference is targeted and enduring operations.
If I have, wait, targeted and enduring operations.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that, like, sure, there are some special operations people on the ground, but it's not enduring
Combat
and targeted.
troops, where does it say that we have to endure in our operations? All
Well,
the
no,
resolution
so
asking
that's
is
the
asking
difference.
is if we're just going to fight them.
Yeah.
At the point
Right,
where,
so
wait,
if I
I have a question. If I call an apple an orange, is it an orange?
All right, right,
Like politically it might be an orange, but functionally it's still an
no, it
apple,
definitely
right?
isn't politically an orange. It is certainly
That's politically an apple? Oh, great, so, okay, that's
right,
awesome.
right. So what I'm going to say, right, is that, like, I've shown you a very denotative difference. Like, the reason, like, all right, reset. We said in 2013, we are stopping combat operations in Iraq, right? But we still left 50,000 people behind. The difference is that we reaffirmed their mission protocols to be not targeted and not
Can I just read what the White House says? Like at the point where, even though the president is claiming that's the case, but the White House literally says that the remaining troops will train and advise. Wait, can I just read the whole thing? Iraqi security forces conduct partnered and targeted counterterrorism operations
I agree.
and protect ongoing U.S. civilian and military efforts. All of this has the potential to involve quite a bit of combat.
Yeah, it has that.
That's what your own
potential.
evidence
That's not the
says.
targeted and enduring operation. That's just not what the resolution's about. Like, I gave you.
It
my
is
quote
what the
about it.
resolution's
No, it's
about.
really
Like
not.
just because you think that it isn't doesn't
Alright,
mean that it
so
isn't.
let's engage in this a step further.
Perfect.
How much are these troop trainers specifically, right? If you isolate for their effect on ISIL, how much are they working to destroy the Islamic State?
Sure, I would say that at the point where I give you the evidence from the DoD that says that thousands of these operational forces has dismantled their administrative structure.
That's
and
special operations.
Oh,
I'm
sure.
asking about troop trainers.
Oh, about troop training? I would say that they aren't very successful because we don't have that many of them there right now.
Okay, so they're not successful right now.
In the status quo, no. But I give you the Pollock evidence that says that when you train and combat advise with them 24/7, you make the training better.
So
So you can actually see if they're like engaging in
So you
sectarian
agree? So
violence
you
or
agree
not.
that the action of affirming is the action of putting like a large
No.
amount of more troops on
The action of affirming is either the status quo now, where we have military advising, or
But that
or a step further, where we send more military advisors.
Ryan,
So it would still be affirming.
Alright, so that's
I'm
what
not
we call-
cherry picking.
that's a
I'm just
plan,
telling you
right?
that
Because
it's
out of
not
all
no,
the combat troops,
you literally say that I have to dig out 100,000 troops. There's no way that I'm the one being abusive.
I'm saying that in order to realistically defeat ISIL, it would take 100,000 troops. What I'm also saying is that in the real world, when you affirm, you put a lot of boots on
Wait,
the
so
ground.
you're saying that ISIS is? That's not.
You guys don't have a card about spec ops, you're just trying to take out the link, right? What, we have a card
Yeah, that's fine.
that says it's, that they're not,
No,
that they're not.
making analysis.
Okay, it was just analysis, would that happen? Okay.
We are gonna run prep starting now.
Here.
Hey, can I ask you a quick question? Just on a card, on a card.
No,
I
we can't
okay.
speak.
I need
30
evidence.
seconds left.
off-time roadmap overview. Download it down there. All three judges ready? Fun. Of course, Brian. Remember the overview Brian puts in today's round. According to Boo, we show you that there's an opportunity cost here because A, we're going to have to commit troops at some point. We better do it now than in the future. Then let's look to my first contention, which talks about the need to intervene. And my opponent is trying to say that there's a humanitarian crisis going on right now. According to the international relations, we act as a buffer. We prevent all abuses because we stop the Sunni and Shia wars by acting as a buffer in today's world. Now remember, in the affirmative world, we stop the issues. In the negative world, the Shias run rampant and commit even worse human rights abuses. That's a comparative world right there. Then let's look to our second subpoint, which talks about regional stability. Now my opponent's trying to say that ISIL is expanding. Exactly. If ISIL expands, we get the impacts from the second card from The Economist that says if unrest spreads to Saudi Arabia, oil prices will spike, causing a double-dip recession, and global prices will will cut U.S. GDP by 5%, directly harming the United States citizens. Then we also show you in our second contention all the affirmative solvency. We show you with Scruton. They never responded to the fact that the air strikes are going to be more effective if we have combat troops pushing them out into the open. Then you also look to the fact that my opponent's trying to say the Spec Ops aren't actually U.S. troops. If Navy SEALs aren't U.S. troops, then I'm also not American. Then if you could also look to the fact that the DoD says that these Spec Ops are actually working and actually decreasing ISIL's power, which in turn means they're functionally the same as combat troops because they're A, seeing combat, and B, they're combat ready. Then you look to the last point on our second contention, which talks about there's no difference between the combat troops and the combat advisors. In fact, the combat troops are more preferable because Pollock says that the key is the fact that the U.S. troops are partnering with the Iraqi troops 24/7, making them more efficient and more effective. Then, on my opponent's case, we also show you on their second contention about political conflicts that the Sunnis are working with the United States, which in turn decreases violence by 50% by providing intel. Then we also show you we're solving for the political issue because the political solutions are being managed when the Maliki government steps down. And by committing troops, we increase democracy by 15%. Then, on their third contention, we show you Choi shows you that the terrorist pursuit that we're doing right now is actually decreasing terror. And according to Woods, they're going to shift all their resources to one area, effectively ending the issue a lot faster because all the resources in one area. Thank you.
Can I see the oil part again?
Yep. Which one?
Right here. Whatever you just impacted.
Yep.
This Saudi Arabia.
Just like highlight this time, or underline or box.
Okay.
With your like red pen.
Can we just see like point
Yeah,
where
here.
it says exactly what? Yeah.
Do you want me to just pull it off? It's like the whole. I'll just pull this up on.
If that's fine, that's really fine for us, Brian.
Okay.
It's fine. Just like, just want to see it in the air again to make sure that we.
Here, let me just pull up the full chart because like I don't think it says it like specific doesn't say it in there. No. It says if oil price rise to $200 a barrel. Three words says specifically unrest. If you want to see that,
No,
in Saudi Arabia.
I want to see where it says ISIS is causing the unrest in Saudi Arabia.
It just says if unrest spreads to Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine then.
Yeah.
Never. Okay. How much do we have left?
A little more.
So just a quick off-time roadmap. It's going to be issues of framing and weighing, inability to solve terrorism, and troop deaths. Okay? Opponents ready? Boards ready? Judges are ready. In terms of impacts in today's round, you're referring the impacts to U.S. lives because that's the clearest, like, uncontroversial impact, right? Because American citizens matter more, and you can't get a life back once you've lost it. Their only impact is oil, and they say if it gets up to $200 a barrel, then that would be a big impact. But they don't actually show what's going to happen. They don't actually show the conflict is going to spread to Saudi Arabia, so we're not getting any impact in today's round. You literally cannot vote for them. but moreover look to the issue of what committing combat ground troops actually means. They say we have spec ops and the status quo, but those aren't combat ground troops. We issue very clearly that there is a political difference, and they say that doesn't matter, but political difference means, like, it changes what actually affirming the resolution actually means. It means that committing combat ground troops means you're putting in a force of a sizable nature and not actually these like special operations forces that they advocate are going to be used in the case. A special operations soldier is not a troop. My partner makes a response and they never respond to it. Clearly, they're not actually linking to the resolution in any discernible way. But the second voting issue in today's round is an inability to solve terrorism. And what's really key and critical here is the box evidence we read you in the second contention, right? And the box evidence says that there are all these Sunni groups right now that are disaffected in the status quo, right? And that if we take out ISIS, these groups have more resonant ideologies and deeper ties in the local Sunni population. And that means if we take out ISIS, we cut the head off the snake, there are just more snakes now and more dangerous snakes, right? Because these have more ties to the local population. They say it's a more brutal and deadlier opposition. They say we can solve this by committing troops, and now it's changing like the political nature. But you can't solve the sectarian divide that has plagued Iraq for centuries. They can't solve for the entirety of this, which is why you're still getting a worse impact if we destroy ISIL. They're not actually solving for any terrorism in today's round. But the last impact is going to be this issue of troop deaths. And the first one response they make is Boot, who says we will intervene anyway. He doesn't say that. He says it's more probable that we intervene, but it's still not likely that we intervene. A vote to neg is a vote to not intervene. Then they say that we won't use that many troops. It won't be 100,000. But even if it's a 10,000, even if it's a fraction, a tenth of the 4,500 deaths that happened previously, even if it's only 450, that's enough to justify a neg ballot. Because terrorism is all Islamic terrorism. Kills 2 people a year. It would take 500 years to actually recoup that lost life. You cannot possibly justify voting for an AF team that doesn't impact terrorism out in any discernible way.
Ready to cross?
Yeah. Yes. Alright, so let's specifically talk about the analysis that you give that says that special operations forces are not combat troops, right?
They're not troops.
How are they not troops?
They're like CIA
How's it
people.
Navy? Wait,
How is
CIA
Navy
is just
SEAL not a
CIA is just intelligence. We know that, right? They're just suits.
No,
Alright,
right.
so Navy SEALs are troops. They're part of the U.S. military, right?
Are Navy SEALs part of the U.S. military? Yes or no?
Is this literally this is a definitional difference, right?
No.
Is the
They're just
Navy-
really good troops.
Is the Navy a branch of the U.S. military?
Is the Navy a branch of the U.S. military?
Yes.
Yeah.
Aren't Navy SEAls just really good Navy members?
Look,
I mean, like, are they? It's just a yes or no question.
Yeah.
look, but we give you a couple of responses, right? We tell you that.
But wait, it's just a yes or no question. Are they part of the military?
Yes, they're part of the military.
So they're military troops.
But it's not the idea of committing combat ground troops. Committing combat ground troops is this change in the status quo, right? That's what we are debating about.
You don't.
There's an authorization for the
you
use
just
of
say
military
you
force on the
You
president's
literally
table.
you keep extending this unwarranted claim that like
It's
the
not
AF
unwarranted,
isn't.
it's backed
You
by
just
the
say
policy
the
matters.
you literally you get up and you go the affirmative isn't the status quo, the negative or the
No,
the affirmative isn't the status quo, the negative is.
Ryan,
You don't say why that's the case.
All right, maybe we can reach like a synthesis, a happy medium, right? Like it's almost certain, and I will concede this, that like an invasion of like ISIL territory will involve some type of a special operation force. I think I'd be stupid to not say that. But what is also certain, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge this, is that an invasion of ISIS territory would almost certainly also involve conventional troops as well.
But what I'm telling
That's
you is
fair,
that in
right?
this
It's compromise.
Isn't
No.
that fair?
No,
Okay.
not at all. Because in the status quo, we're not doing that. We're not taking the approach of sending 100,000 troops. We're taking the more practical approach of being successful with special operations forces.
Let me ask you another question. First, it's from a different angle, right? Why did we say we pulled out troops when we left Iraq?
Because the president wants people to think that we're not there.
He's lying to all of us, and somehow your journalist
Yeah.
who you're quoting somehow knows
The
differently.
news doesn't tell the truth all the time. That's the point.
And you found one article that does.
I'm telling you that logic, your own article, yeah, you're right, your own article that from Foreign Policy Magazine.
No, not the article that we're citing, the authorization to use
Fine, the White House
combat
evidence.
troops.
Fine, the White House evidence that
Yeah.
says that even though politically they aren't called that, they are that. So even though they
No,
aren't
no.
called in orange,
No, it's
they
a
still
definition.
are in
You
orange.
can't say like, isn't it?
Just because they aren't called something doesn't mean they aren't something.
Like what you're doing, if I'm going to use this orange analysis, right, is looking at a lemon and saying, well, it's not called a lemon, but it's sort of a similar fruit, right? It tastes citrus.
I
So it's sort of like
So here's the functional
how many
problem.
Americans?
Here's the
Nice
functional
question.
problem.
Guys,
Last
you
question.
asked the last one.
How
Here's the
many
functional
Americans?
problem with like
Last
that.
question.
Go ahead.
All right, go.
How many Americans will die? How many Americans can we save by committing combat ground troops?
Tons.
How
I
many?
need the boot evidence that specifically says that we would have to send even more troops.
Evidence
So if
doesn't
you
say
say-
you're going
If
to
you don't,
send
respond,
Ryan.
you don't
If you
respond to the third warrant that I says that the majority of
Ryan, I
Americans
challenge
already want to
that.
send troops.
We have,
How much? Like 7 seconds if you do use it.
I'm just gonna say good luck to Brian. Good luck, bud. Thanks. Alright, it's gonna be good sign for this game. Are all three judges ready? Opponents?
Yeah.
And of course, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Alright.
They undercover the boot evidence. Remember that if ISIS does expand, which their own evidence says that they will in their first contention, then that means that we're going to have to send U.S. troops in the future. They say that's not probable. They drop the actual warrants as to why it's true. The majority of Americans already want to send troops. If they're more war hungry and they feel less safe, that means that more troops are going to die in the future. You turn all of their impacts because ISIS is expanding when we don't give troops. But furthermore, remember, the Department of Defense evidence that was cold drop says that thousands of special operations forces have dismantled the administrative capability of ISIL, so they're going to fail in the long term. But remember that the whole distinction. Remember that I give you the evidence that says that even though they're not dubbed combat troops, they still are combat troops because they actually engage in a combat role numerous times. But furthermore, a Navy SEAL is obviously a combat troop. He's just a really good one. Furthermore, the second place you vote is going to be off the fact that we're solving for everything. Remember I give you the Troy evidence that says that overall, looking at 166 countries, terrorist pursuit missions decrease terrorism. That also takes into account anti-US terrorism, so that outweighs on breadth and depth of information. But then furthermore, remember, I give you the Woods evidence. This is where you can sign your ballot. Remember that at the point where they're literally going to shift all of their resources to one region, we can literally shut down the fighting with minimal effort in just a few days. No American lives will be lost. At that point, you can prevent all of the harmful impacts from happening. First, remember, on our subpoint B, A, we're showing you that the regional Shia-Sunni jihadist conflict causes a GDP spike by 5%. But then secondarily, they say, oh, it's regrettable but manageable, but not if ISIS keeps expanding. Remember that I show you that economic unrest will lead to a doubling in oil prices, which causes a double dip recession. But then furthermore, they say in the long term, we're not going to solve for this because of the Hydra effect. But remember that that's assuming that they're not going to work with the United States and not reach a political solution. I give you the Mirnick evidence that Fenix says troops increase democracy by 15%, so it creates a more inclusive government in the long term, and you're not going to see this Hydra effect. But then, last but not least, on troop training. Remember that even if you buy their definition of combat advising, Ben turns it because he says that when you're with them 24/7 in combat, you make this troop training a lot better. That's why you root out corruption and it solves back the Iraqi government committing human rights violations because they act as a buffer, preventing retaliatory killings on both sides. For all these reasons, I see nothing but an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
17.
Okay, take that.
I understand why they have all this time.
Everything they're saying is worse, just in a clear view. Everything is worse, and the answer doesn't actually seem to be a it's making it up.
Alright. Opponents? Partner? Yeah. Judges? Alright, so let's start with framework. So first, you value lives above everything else. They kind of agree to that. Almost all of their cases an impact to oil. The only thing in their case that doesn't impact to oil is what Brian tries to extend in Final Focus. That's max boot. But he cold drops Ben's 2 responses to it. And honestly, like he literally didn't respond to these, that they should be flowed through. The 2 responses are 1, Boot says conflict is more likely, but he never says it's probable. That means that there's really no offense because it's not weighed at all in his Final Focus. But secondly, and this really damns the Boot out of the bat, because he says, because Ben says a neg vote is a vote against war, period. That means that we fiat solve Boot. Let's go into why we're winning. So first, like on the level of what combat ground troops are, sure, special operations will be involved in the fight, but let's not kid ourselves and ignore the negative evidence that says the conventional troops won't be involved if you affirm. That's 100,000 more boots on the ground. But like this is where we really win, right? It's the idea of the long term. Because even if everything that they're saying is true, even if they clear out ISIS, you buy Vox for my second contention. What does Vox say? It says that insofar that we don't solve all sectarian conflict, we don't solve Iraqi nationalism like Baathism, ISIS-like groups come out of the woodwork when we finish ISIL, right? Unless there's a long-term solution. That means that and also these groups are more dangerous because we've reinforced sectarianism by intervening and we've painted an anti-American flag on our backs. If they don't provide that long-term solution, if there's even one iota of doubt in your mind as to whether or not going in guns blazing and then leaving will solve this problem, you negate on face value because it's just not worth the troop lives. And let's do the simplest cost-benefit analysis, because my opponent throws around a lot of high-value impacts, but these are the cleanest. My judges ask for clean impacts. These are the only things you know. In their world, in our world, 2 Americans a year die from transnational terrorism. In their world, a lot of Americans die when we invade, up to reasonable estimates of 4,500 Americans. At that point, a a very, very simple cost-benefit analysis tells you that it's just not worth sending them in. Lives are the most important thing, and we've shuttered their oil impacts by talking about long-term sectarianism, which turns the idea of oil because the new groups will also be unstable. Thank you.